United States at the moment. I've never been a housing minister. I've done all those other things. I've been a Minister of Social Security, of Pensions, for Wales, the Foreign Secretary, Leader of the House of Commons, and so somehow I've escaped being a housing minister, so I'm no expert on this. Although having sat in the Commons for 26 years, I am a bullshit expert. If any of our panelists think they're going to get away with putting things together that don't make any sense, I will try to do my imitation of Jeremy Paxman in exposing that, but you may do that, of course, yourselves in the audience. But although I've never been a housing minister, anybody who's been in politics is aware of the extent of anxieties, concerns, and hopes in this country about housing. Indeed, one of the few issues on which I rebelled against my party when I was a new Member of Parliament in North Yorkshire was about housing in rural areas, when I voted to allow more affordable housing to be built on the edges of existing villages in national parks, specifically in the Yorkshire Dales. The landscape is very different there from London, as Rupert's just been hinting, but one of the issues is the same. How can young people afford to live in a place like that, in that case beautiful countryside, where many other people with a greater supply of money want to live ahead of them? And of course these problems are nationwide in the UK. We are looking at a population increase in the UK from 65 million now towards 80 million in about 20 years' time, if forecasts are to be believed. The fastest growing population in Europe. We're expected to overtake Germany in the 2040s, depending on immigration levels into each of the countries, as the most populous nation in Europe, and we're already one of the most densely populated places in Europe, in the southeast of England, along with the Netherlands. And this did feature in the referendum campaign, when the Leave campaign argued sometimes we would have to build a house every 4 minutes to keep up with population growth in the UK. The reason the Remain campaign didn't rebut that very much is because the real figure is apparently every 7 minutes for the next 20 years, and that wasn't going to be very reassuring to people. And so they desisted from that particular argument. But the growth of population is now an immense public and political issue. And at the center of all this, of course, is London, where all of these issues that affect the UK are actually magnified in their size and in their nature. And that's what we're going to be talking about this morning: how to build more homes of a type that people want, where they need them, at a price they can afford, with the consent of local communities, is a central preoccupation for people living in London. We've had the mayoral election with a new mayor. He's already made some important decisions. We have a new housing minister who is a London MP from Croydon, Gavin Barwell. He's already made some important statements. So these panels are about what is the way forward, and you have assembled, I must say, a remarkable range of experts, of leaders, of builders who want to give us their views and influence our views this morning. And we're going to have 4 panels, each of them with people giving their views for a few minutes each, and then plenty of time, I hope, for discussion. The first panel is just going to last half an hour or so that we can have a fresh injection of coffee at an early stage of our proceedings, but then we have 3 more panels coming along. So I'd be very grateful if the first panelist could come up to the stage and join me. That's Richard Blakeway, Colin Stanbridge, and Mark Collins, if they could please join me on the stage. I'll go where you go there, and yeah, that's great. Yeah. Thank you very much. Right, so this is our first panel, which is about where are we now? These gentlemen are in an extremely good position to talk to us about that. What state did Boris Johnson leave the London housing market in? What will his housing legacy be? How much influence should politics have on housing development? Is politics stifling or sparking house building? What is the scope for greater collaboration between all involved, including government and local authorities in the future? The opening speaker and panelist is Richard Blakeway, a former deputy mayor. He clearly knows the outgoing Mayor Boris very well and was his housing man. Likewise, Colin Stanbridge on my right worked very closely with the mayor. Mark Collins, a big London agent as well as property chairman at the London Chamber of Commerce. So, a very expert panel. And Richard, you're going to start off giving us 5 minutes or so. I shall start harumphing if you do much more than that, of your views on this, and then the others will come in with a few minutes of their views. Then we'll have an exchange and come out to the audience here as well. Over to you.
Great, thanks very much. Morning, folks. There's obviously a big focus at today's event on two mayors, on the last mayor and clearly the current mayor. I'd just like to start off my few minutes of comments by paying tribute to the first mayor, because I think it's fair to say that Ken Livingstone, in establishing the GLA, also established the parameters for London's growth, working clearly very closely with Richard Rogers at the time, the idea of a compact city, the idea that London's growth should be managed within London's boundary and particularly see significant growth in the centre of the capital was I think something that has influenced not just the policy making of Boris Johnson, but is also leaving a legacy for Sadiq Khan, and I will hear from James later, but I'd be very surprised if we didn't see a real push for London's growth to broadly fit that template of a compact city. He established the London Plan, the first spatial planning document for the city, and he also established the planning decision-making powers of the GLA. So I think a real legacy there, which then, when Boris was elected in 2008, as I say, had a great influence, although you saw changes, of course, as you would do with any mayor, when Boris came into office. I think it's really important to put into context that period in which Boris was mayor. He left office earlier this year in what many would say was a real housing boom. People were saying, hey, how long can this continue? A real housing boom. But it wasn't like that back in 2008. We were experiencing extremely challenging economic conditions and a real loss of confidence in the housing industry. There was another, and that really influenced, obviously, the shape of housing policy and how do we just get schemes which had started and stalled? How do we just get those built? And that lasted for almost the whole, actually the whole of Boris's first term. I think the other really significant event, which is going to have an influence on this city for decades to come, was the 2011 census. And that just showed, and William referred to the population growth nationwide, it just showed the extent to which London was growing at a far faster rate than anyone had previously anticipated. We were a city that had a record population of 8.6 million people, the most in its history, the previous peak being 1939, and it was rapidly going to be a city, and will be a city, of 10 million people. The change was happening across the whole of the capital. So the fastest growing borough was an outer London borough, it was Hillingdon. But the change in some parts of London is quite astonishing. So between those two censuses, the ward, Church Street ward, which is in Westminster, its population had grown by 70%. So there's extraordinary change happening within the capital. That obviously influenced, therefore, the quantum of homes. And we always talk about housing in the context of supply. It's obviously a broader issue than supply, but just focusing in on supply, it obviously changed the context for house building targets. So we set a target of 49,000 homes, basically 50,000 homes, to be built every year. The highest net supply, if achieved, that would be the highest net supply that's been seen in this city since the 1930s. So an astonishingly ambitious target from a baseline of roughly about half that, broadly about 25,000 completions each year in the city. What's important to recognise is that rate was it's broadly what's been delivered each year in London for about 30 years. So, and when I talked earlier about the economic context of a recession, a very deep recession, followed by a housing boom. It's astonishing if you discount a couple of years where there was very sharp economic conditions, it's astonishing actually how constant the completions rate was during that period. So there were some deep structural issues which were far broader than the general economic conditions or general housing market. There were some deep structural issues that clearly need to be addressed. To try and achieve that, one of the things which we focused on was to try and complement those planning powers that Ken Livingstone established with housing investment powers, with assets. So we had the Localism Act, and we changed the legislation, which then allowed the GLA to actually invest in housing. We assembled a very large land portfolio, probably the largest public land portfolio in London, and we invested with the support of government, billions of pounds into housing. I would say, of course, I'm a neutral and unbiased commentator on this. Of course, I would say that I think there were some real milestones achieved, but there really were. I mean, you saw 100,000 affordable homes completed, roughly one every half an hour. So that's probably, in the context of the building rate needed, not as high as it should have been. Land was all released. Every surplus site was released during that mayoralty. 414 hectares, something like 50,000 homes or 1.5 million square feet of commercial space as well. Really, and the establishment of the Housing Zones Initiative, which I think was trying to get London to think differently about how it invested and supported house building, how it focused very much on place, and how it made funding programs fit the place rather than expecting schemes to fit the funding program. And you've now got over 30 of those housing zones around London, which are trying to integrate housing with infrastructure, the vital infrastructure that's needed, not just the big infrastructure, but the bridges, some road improvements, that sort of stuff, which is as important as the Crossrails. Crossrails important, of course, but as important as that. And there was non-supply measures taken as well, efforts to improve the private rented sector, efforts to try and get more mobility amongst social tenants to allow them to move across the 33 boroughs, and efforts to tackle rough sleeping. I'll just close very quickly with a reflection, because of course, even though I think there were a number of innovative approaches taken under the last mayor and some real progress made, particularly, as I say, around land and around housing investment, ultimately people will point at the housing numbers, the completions numbers, and say, and judge success in that context. We'll have to see what the numbers are for the last year of the mayoralty. They will be published, I think, probably next February as part of the annual monitoring report. Our expectation is it will probably show completions somewhere between the mid to the late 30,000s. So below the 49,000, but probably the highest in the GLA's history for overall supply. And I've given you that affordable housing numbers, and they were very, very strong over the mayoralty. But below that 49,000, which I think just shows what a challenge it is to actually build 50,000 homes a year. So some thoughts on how, therefore, how do we do it, going from what happened to where are we now? And I guess a couple of, three quick thoughts on, three very quick thoughts. The first is the role of the suburbs, because most of the growth was still coming in zones 1 and 2. Now, clearly the market is looking beyond zones 1 and 2, and everyone's been buying land in outer London. But the role of the suburbs is critical, and the role of industrial land in this city is also critical. We too often talk about the green belt. We should be focused on what is the role for industrial land in this city, and what's the right balance between industrial and residential land. Second point is competition. We were still heavily reliant on a very small number of developers to actually build the homes. So how do you get more competition into the market? And the final point is, how do you integrate better transport and housing growth? There was, too often again, we look at Crossrail, and Crossrail 2, I sat on the commission for Crossrail 2, it is hugely ambitious plans for residential growth, 200,000 homes to complement the building of that line. But actually, we need to do far more to look at the small infrastructure, as I referred to before, as well as the big infrastructure and the role of TfL, if we're really to unlock development sites, and particularly smaller development sites, because so much of London's pipeline is focused on large schemes. About 3/4 of London's pipeline is focused on large schemes, which are often more vulnerable in economic cycles.
Okay. Thank you, Richard, for saying a lot in a short time. I appreciate that. Not quite short enough, but thank you for that. And one or two of the questions you raised there at the end we're coming on to in a later panel, such as transport and housing. But a very upbeat assessment there of Boris's time as mayor. Boris himself could not have given a more upbeat assessment, but with a real bit of frank honesty there as well about the decline in numbers in this final year, probably. But Colin, what do you make of this? You give us a few minutes on your assessment of where we are now.
Well, I think just to go back on what Rick has said, and I think we must pay tribute to Rick, because Rick has been that voice, that powerhouse of enthusiasm and energy that I suspect got to Boris and made sure that Boris was on the housing agenda in the right way. I think that Rick's absolutely right. You know, history will, I'm afraid, pass judgment on Boris by the numbers. And by your own admission, we need, 50,000 houses a year. 30,000 is quite a long way short. However, I think that what Boris did do, and maybe a bit too late in his mayoralty, is recognise the seriousness of the housing crisis that was facing London. And he did a number of things. We were very keen on this London Land Commission, which we had, I characterised to Boris a doomsday book of brownfield sites. I thought the doomsday reference would get Boris's attention, which I think it did. And I think that was a great thing to push forward. And he embodied what was great about the mayoralty. I think the mayoralty has been one of the great successes for London since it was introduced. Because he became that beacon, that voice that stood up for London and focused because of his democratic mandate and was able to focus, and because of his character, just as Ken had and just as Sadiq will in the future, be able to focus on the problem facing London. I would say that maybe the problem was we didn't focus early enough. I'd also say that one of the things that we think that needs to be done, we've been saying this for the last 2 or 3 years, is that the big developers are never going to be able to build the 30, 40, 50,000 houses. I mean, our president is Tony Pidgley, who we'll be hearing from a bit later on, and Tony's one of the first to say that you need an army of small house builders. We have lost those small house builders, those people that can take those small sites that the London Land Commission will identify, and it will be viable, economically viable, for them to build 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 units on there. And we need to make sure that we're doing all we can to incentivize those people. It means talking to the banks, it means taking them into consideration when you're planning this. And I think that if we had a criticism of Boris, it would be that I'm not sure that he fully took on board that message, that was still too much thinking about the big developers, the big schemes, when in fact, if London's really going to succeed, you need a whole myriad of small schemes. So I would say, yes, well done, Boris, for recognising, but he leaves a big hurdle to jump from that 30,000, if that's correct, maybe more, but even 35,000 to 50,000. Because the problem will be going forward that Brexit, as Lord Hague has pointed out, will dominate all the conversations. And it's important that the new mayor makes sure that housing doesn't slip down, that we don't become so obsessed by trade deals and immigration, all big issues, that we forget, actually, that whatever happens, London's going to continue growing. Whatever happens, there will be a housing crisis of some sort, and therefore we need to make sure that we're concentrating on it, that London's concentrating on it, and that we get the support from government. It needs more of a focus on devolution to give the mayor more powers. The mayoralty, as I said, been a great success. What it's lacked, of course, is the real power, the power to raise money. Hence, the London Finance Commission being reconvened is a very good thing, but we need to make sure that we push the government. We need more devolution, and one of the reasons we need that is because we need to house people. Because if you destroy London's ability to house people, you will harm not just London economy, you will harm the national economy.
Thank you. Very clear. These speeches are much clearer and to the point than anything I ever endured in the House of Commons. I have to say, I think there's a big future for both of you. No. So let's see if we can match that. But a very clear message there about the importance of small and medium-sized house builders to fill the gap in meeting future housing targets. So, Mark Collins, what do you think about that and about the whole situation that the others have been addressing?
It's a hard act to follow, I think, is probably where I start. I think, probably just to stress, I'm wearing my chairman's hat of the Property and Construction Group for the Chamber, supporting Colin and my colleagues. And I think some of the points obviously have been made. I just want to focus, if I may, on two particular topics that I think are really important that we need to get back to. Rick obviously talked about infrastructure, clearly very important, and we talk about Crossrail. It's only 18 months away, and that is going to really change the whole landscape of London. And I think you've already said the stats, 60,000 new homes as a direct result of that impact in terms of infrastructure for Crossrail. Crossrail 2, I think, then becomes even more important. And if you go back in time to Crossrail, that was first mooted, I'm sure you all know this, in 1974, will be delivered in 2017-18. We need real vision now to really make these things happen at a much faster pace. And going back to everything that Rick said, and obviously the previous mayor, and congratulations to you, Rick, as well. Fantastic work in progress, but we need more of it. We need the Bunsen burner turned up a lot more to actually deliver that gap, because 35 to 50,000 is still a heck of a way to go. Colin referenced the smaller builders. That's something I'm very passionate about, and I think that we need to deal with it at both ends. So we have our larger developers, house builders, and then we have the SMEs coming up from the bottom up. And I think the important part of that is how do we really encourage the smaller house builders to develop sites of 10, 20, 50 units. SIL, I think, is an important aspect to that. We need to be much smarter and create solutions to defer payments, make it easier. The Chamber produced what I thought was a very, very impressive paper called Getting Our House in Order. It made reference to that, and perhaps having a ceiling of up to 50 units where there is some deferment in terms of that SIL payment. So I think it's a combination of all those things, but what we need to do is we need to make it happen quicker, and I think particularly in the build-to-rent market, a huge opportunity to provide all levels of tenure for people to live in, but we need to speed up that process.
Thank you. Also very clear. And I know people will have questions about this, and the panelists may want to react to things that they each have said. But let me just start off the questions. Richard, you gave, as I said, this upbeat assessment of what had been achieved, but acknowledging more needs to be achieved in the future. But in driving up that the number of houses that were built in London over his 8 years in office, did Boris do enough on the affordable housing? Because there is Sadiq Khan now saying actually he will get more affordable housing within any given housing total. What was the constraint on Boris in that field?
So I think there'll always be a pressure not just for the quantum of homes, but for the affordability of the homes. And unfortunately, we often talk about the definition of affordable housing within the confines of homes which are given planning consent as affordable housing, when in reality for the majority of Londoners, they're interested in the non-affordable housing in strictly planning terms, and they're interested in the market housing and the affordability of that. But just focused in on the affordable housing, what happened during Boris's period was a significant change in the funding regime for affordable housing. So we went from a period where you see probably about 70% to 80% of the build cost being funded through grant to one where it flipped to the opposite. So you probably saw about 15 to 20% of the build cost being funded by government through grant. A significant change which saw the role of housing associations completely change as well, and the risk that they had to take and the borrowing that they had to take to co-fund. But you saw the supply of affordable housing broadly continue, and indeed I would say increase. So in the penultimate year of the mayoralty, you saw the highest number of completions since 1981. I think that and you saw a change in the range of products as well. So kind of first-time buyer products coming through as well as rented products. I think on particular, what's striking in London though is that wherever the target's set, you actually end up with broadly the same proportion being delivered. So Ken Livingstone had a target of 50%, and he broadly saw about 35% of schemes delivering affordable housing. Under Boris, it varied, but again, I would argue, you'd be over the 8 years, you'd be somewhere towards about a third affordable housing coming forward. And on some schemes, you see significantly higher proportions. On other schemes, you see less, depending on the viability. And obviously, I think that viability debate is now the one where I think James Murray and Sadiq Khan is absolutely right to shine a light and to say, how do we get more transparency around viability? And I applaud James's focus on that.
Any comments on that from the others?
Well, I think affordable, obviously, is something that's close to many Londoners' hearts, and especially those of us, with teenage children, as I have. How are they going to get on the housing ladder? Especially when I've sold the house and spent all the money in my dotage on drugs and rock and roll, all the things that we need to do in our 70s and 80s, because that's going to be the legacy that we leave for those future generations. And I think it's all very well talking about 50% affordability, and many people would cheer that. But actually, can you do that? And there are parts of London where you can do that, and maybe it's affordable to do that. But certainly in Outer London, I was on the Mayor's Outer London Commission. Outer London is a real problem. Many people who live in Outer London don't want lots of building of houses there, because that's why they live in Outer London. And also the viability of the idea of 50% in Outer London suburbs, I just don't think is possible. Very interesting to see what James says later today, and how the message is going to be modified.
I think, just to support what I've already said, I think if you come back to Crossrail, it's opened up whole new markets. And we often talk about zones 3 to 6. You look at the Crossrail facility at Abbey Wood, what will hopefully happen at Old Oak Common, depending obviously on Crossrail 2 as well. So it's these larger regen areas that I think provide a real opportunity to provide more affordable and the different tenure of mix, as I referenced. And regen and placemaking are critical to that. And Tony Pidgeot, I'm sure, will mention later in the morning that, our key workers, people who obviously operate all our important services, where are they going to live? Where's their home? They don't want to travel an hour and a half into their place of work. So we need to find a more creative solution, but it's, I think, a combination of all those factors. And then ultimately, who's going to build the homes to deliver?
Questions from the floor before we have our next installment of coffee. Yes, then, it might be a good idea to say who you are and who you represent when you ask your question. And there is Rupert is scurrying along with a microphone there for you.
Hello, Martin Skinner from Inspired Homes. One of the key challenges, I think, in the face of Brexit is to maintain and increase supply against a more nervous background. But one of the great opportunities is potentially to deregulate, reduce taxation, become a better place to do business. What do you think is going to potentially come down the road on that front?
Very good. Straight into Brexit. Here, there was I saying, what a relief to go to a meeting that isn't about Brexit. But no, it's a very important question. Is there an opportunity for the housing sector in Brexit in terms of regulation, taxation? Anybody got any thoughts? Carl, you've been having a lot of your own roundtables
we
on
have,
this
we
issue.
have, and of course there are huge opportunities that we can identify. As I said, I think the real problem is that we become obsessed in the minutiae of negotiations, etc., and the focus doesn't laser-like go on to things like housing. So I think that's the problem. Maybe we need somebody with maybe the boldness of the new mayor should be something revolutionary, where you have a bonfire of red tape, but in return developers have to supply in terms of housing and affordable housing. Maybe that something big needs to be done in terms of energizing people, especially in the light of Brexit, because Brexit will just sort of go on and on and on.
So is there red tape we could put on a bonfire now we're leaving the EU that would actually liberate the housing sector?
So the one we're probably both going to say the same one. OJU.
Yes.
Here is your chance. Everyone would just go on at me about OJU, the procurement rules when you're releasing public land. God, this was a headache. Best value, but it was a frequent complaint. So there is your opportunity: is to look at the procurement rules, assuming that we continue to do procurements rather than just market disposal. Without running a competition or a procurement process. That's your opportunity. And I mean, our way around it to try and comply, well, we did comply with OJU rules, sorry, very important for the lawyers. We did comply with OJU rules, but to simplify and to try and make the disposals mechanisms more efficient was to set up a framework panel, and we, by procuring that panel of 25 developers through OJU, we could then dispose of sites much more quickly. We did one in 3 months, for example, so quicker and cheaper through the use of framework panels, which you'll all be very familiar with. Obviously, the downside with framework panels is they're procured for 3 or 4 years, and so that's when someone pops along and says, hey, I got tons of cash and loads of ambition, can I go on your framework? Well, you can't without reprocuring the entire framework, which obviously would defeat, if you're continuously reprocuring the framework, it defeats the purpose of setting it up in the first place, which is where the real tension point is. So looking at procurement rules and particularly best consideration.
Were you going to make the same point?
I was. Just to add to it, I think also slightly different dimension and answer to your question is that I think for investors, whether they're UK investors, overseas investors, they don't like surprises, they like certainty. And I think the quicker we can make some of these decisions about what is going to happen, and we don't want to go into the big discussion now, we don't have enough time, but I think we just need real clarity, and the quicker we can get clarity, the easier it will be. And that will then facilitate all the things we've just talked about.
There was another question, gentleman next door. Yeah. Microphone's coming back.
Simon Jeffrey from Countryside, so we're one of the larger developers that work with procurement through OJU processes. One of the questions was going to be about trying to speed up procurement, but as well as speeding up the procurement itself, where you might do it over, say, 3 months rather than a year, I was wondering the fact that I did a soft market testing 2 years ago on a project, and it was released about 3 months ago. How can we work with the local authorities to bring those sites forward faster?
Any idea, Mark?
Just a quick one from me. I think we heard about this just recently, that I think the local authorities need more support in their planning departments. What does that mean? Does that mean more financial support to provide more offices? Are developers prepared to perhaps pay a premium to get through that process quicker, to provide more staff? I think that's one ingredient. I think it's a combination of all the things we've already said. But obviously the planning process is taking too long in that sense. So what are the solutions we can do to speed it up, whether it's SIL, as I've already referenced as well, but just trying to make it a much smoother process, and whether it's through OJU or the other things, making it happen quicker.
And I think that
Colin.
one of the, I hope, the byproducts, if we convince the government and especially the Treasury for more fiscal devolution, more devolution of powers to London and tax-raising powers to London, is that if we do that, then we're going to have greater cooperation, cross-working amongst boroughs. I mean, Ken had the idea, I think, of 5 boroughs, didn't he? 4 around the outside and 1 in the middle. And I think that we're never going to have that. We're never going to get rid of all the boroughs. But what I think we need is closer working together. And planning would be one of the things, because one of the complaints we get is that, in Westminster, for example, I think people generally think the Westminster Planning Department is very, very good. There are other boroughs who don't have the wealth of those to do it. And I think by working together, cross-working, now it's terribly difficult, because if you're a local council, the last thing you want to do is sort of vote for the end of your regional or local power. But it's got to happen, and I hope that fiscal devolution will energize that.
Final comment on this from Richard?
I think it's a fair question about public sector land more broadly, and I think the problem is that most public sector landowners don't really have an asset strategy or a sense of purpose around around the use of their assets when they become surplus. One of the advantages I think that we had is that we set a very clear target under Boris that all of our surplus assets will be released, and we achieved that. Not a number of homes will be delivered on it, the number of homes will come out the back end of the land release, because that would have led to a process where we were looking at releasing the biggest sites first just to hit the number of homes. But instead we went and said very clearly everything that's surplus should be released. The problem is that most public landowners simply don't have a strategy in place at all, and if they do have a strategy in place, then it wouldn't be focused on that, because I think the real challenge with most public landowners is they own those for hospitals, for schools, wherever the services are that they're delivering, and the idea of surplus land being used for regeneration is an afterthought and not core to their purpose. And that cultural challenge you've got in those organisations, where they just want the facilities, they don't want to think as a developer, is the biggest thing you've got to overcome if you're actually going to make use and optimise all that surplus public land.
Well, that comment will lead us on nicely to the next session, which is partly about that. But is there anybody got one more question on this session? Yes, sir, there, yes.
Hi, I'm Mario Carosa from the Carradine Group. We've been providing housing through permitted development. I've done over 1,000 units this year. I just wanted your opinions on permitted development, your thoughts going forward, and if it's had any impact on the housing crisis.
On permitted development?
Yes.
Who's going to comment on that?
Rick, you're the expert.
Richard again? Yeah. Then we're going to release
his favourite topic.
Permitted development. Look, I mean, when I went to number 10 very briefly, because the Prime Minister resigned, but when I went to number 10 after working for Boris, one of the policies where I sensed the government was most proud was actually around permitted developments, because the number of residential units coming through the office to resi conversion was huge. It was really very significant contribution to overall housing supply. Of course, the challenge and the argument which was always made.
Oh, we think yes, your microphone is.
The challenge that we had in London, and the argument which the previous mayor made, and I suspect to a degree will be made by this mayor, is it's important to protect some of the high streets and the role of of office space and the importance of office space in the city. And that comes back to my core comment, which is too often we look at how to meet London's growth challenges as, well, let's sprawl, let's just get bigger as a city and let's gobble up the green belt. Whereas in reality, actually, I think we've got to think very, very carefully about the land uses and the balance of land uses within the existing footprint of the capital. And I highlighted industrial land, for example. All the focus is on offices, but the reality is actually industrial land is a critical contribution to the city. But at the same time, its use is very segregated from residential. And I just think that with the change in we call it industrial land, but in reality, it's not, pumping out emissions. It's very different. It's very different industries now in those spaces, and I think it could be more integrated with residential, and that would help us use that land more efficiently and effectively to meet all of London's growth challenges.
Well, thank you. A very quick final comment on that.
And I think, just to support that, I think placemaking and the importance of public realm is critical as part of that. It's a holistic solution. It's not one dynamic.
Thank you. Well, we said we had experts. We've had, obviously, 3 real experts here. I think that's raised many issues about deregulation, about use of public land, about the need for small and medium-sized builders, and many other issues. And we've looked at the legacy of Boris. And the first time I ever went campaigning for Boris, he was a candidate in North Wales and for the Conservative Party. And I went there, I said, how are you getting on, Boris? He said, it's going to be huge. And I said, well, what's going to be huge? He said, I don't know, but it's going to be huge. And the Labour majority was huge on that occasion. So I think we've decided this morning, yes, he's done a lot of things that were huge, but maybe not huge enough on housing. So we're going to look at what happens next in our coming sessions. So thank you very much. We've had a good start. We'll have a quick break and reconvene in about 10 minutes for our next session. Thank you.